One. This is Dr. Elliott. This is the lecture for PD 589 titled Assessing the Affective Domain. So this follows on from our previous lectures where we've looked at the psychomotor domain and the cognitive domain. So now we turn our attention to the third domain, which is often the one that is the most overlooked, and there's some reasons for that, and we'll talk about those reasons as we move into this lecture. So we know that as physical educators and health educators, we are responsible for assessing and teaching on multiple domains, and we often talk about the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. More and more common, we're seeing a fourth domain referenced, which is the health-related physical fitness domain. But it's unique for us in that we're asked to assess on all of these domains, whereas other subject areas perhaps not so much. They mainly focus on the cognitive domain. So as we've stated earlier in this course, if we assess something, then we know that students will perceive it as important. We believe this is true, or just as true, for the affective domain as it is for the psychomotor and cognitive domains. The affective domain encompasses the feelings, attitudes, and dispositions that students have towards something. And in our case, that something is physical education, physical activity, health and wellness, or any of the content that we are discussing and trying to make important to the students. So throughout this lecture, I'm going to try to explain to you how we can assess the affective domain, and I'm going to provide several different examples of how you can assess your students in this domain. Some of them are similar to the psychomotor and cognitive domain, but obviously we will apply affective domain examples into those assessment tools. If we take a step back and think back to your undergraduate experience, if they were in physical education, we know that there's inappropriate ways to do assessment. And just as a quick review of those, we know that we cannot be too heavy on the dress and attendance part of assessment. We need to remember that assessment is multifaceted, and that there needs to be several ways to assess students, not just one single way, such as a fitness test. We've talked about this before, that assessment should be done for multiple reasons other than just grading, and that we should try to include authentic assessments in what we do instead of just assessing in highly controlled situations. NASPE, National Association for Sport and Physical Education, they did have a say on what we should be doing for appropriate instruction. If you recall back to those developmentally appropriate practice documents, and some of those things that they stated are on this slide in front of you. In terms of appropriate instruction, we should be including all students of all ability levels. We should be aiming for maximum participation. We should be designing lessons that facilitate student learning. We should have out-of-school assignments that support learning. We shouldn't be using physical activity as a punishment. And then the one that's relevant for this lecture is that we should be using regular assessment to monitor, reinforce, and plan for student learning. So just a quick review there, as I like to do every week, on why assessment's particularly important. So as we begin to look at the affective domain, I started off by saying that it's looking at the feelings, attitudes, and dispositions. If we want to go just a wee bit further than that, we can look at the areas that are listed on this slide. They also fall under the affective domain area. So you might want to assess some of these, the attitudes and the cooperation skills, self-responsibility skills of your student, because I'm sure you can understand that our job as educators isn't just to teach kids motor skills and to teach them fitness skills, but it's to teach them how to operate and how to participate and follow the etiquette of different activities so that they can be successful for a lifetime in those activities. Excuse me. So traditionally, assessing the affective domain has been difficult. There's several reasons we want to assess the affective domain. First of all, as we've stated, if we assess it, it lets students know that we consider those behaviors important. And there's few areas or other places in the school curriculum where the affective domain is assessed. When working with others, it is often affective domain behaviors that spell success. Students need to be aware of their actions and how those actions influence their relationships with others. And holding students accountable for these behaviors in our classes emphasizes the importance of these actions. A second reason for holding students accountable for the affective domain dispositions is that if students care about others and act in ways that show this, I think the class will function more efficiently and effectively. Just imagine the chaos, and you may have seen this in your own classes, that would result if students were disrespectful of others and didn't listen to your directions. If affective dispositions, such as those listed on the last slide, are assessed, we can guide students to become more responsible adults while improving the emotional climate of our classes. So lots of reasons why we want to assess the affective domain. So with that in mind, why is this pretty rare? Why does this not happen? Well, I think unlike cognitive and psychomotor assessments, which we can make fairly objective, it's more difficult with the affective domain. Because if we just pick one of those things that are on the last slide, effort is very subjective. How do we measure effort? What does good effort versus okay effort versus bad effort look like? How do we operationalize or make that into some kind of concrete idea rather than the abstractness of what these words are? So trying to figure out what is effort, if I asked you all to write a definition of effort and identify 3 behaviors that you would expect from your students that demonstrate effort in your class, we might come up with different things. You might talk about enjoying the activity, willingness to participate, respect for others, demonstrating leadership, but we might all come up with different things, a variety of responses, because effort really means different things to different people. So when we ask students to display 100%, that's really hard to operationalize what that really looks like. So this is one reason why the affective domain has been fairly difficult for us to measure and assess and evaluate in our classes. If we attach this or anchor this in some kind of theoretical framework, we can look at some different affective domain levels. And there's some levels on the left hand side here: characterization, organization, valuing, responding, and receiving. And there's a description after each of those along with some action verbs. And then an example objective related to badminton on the right hand side here. So as you begin to think about this, there are some good resources out there that can help you write student learning objectives that will align nicely with the affective domain. So as we begin to look at how do we develop affective domain assessments, the first thing that we need to do is to identify the actions from the students that are acceptable indicators of student meeting the expectations for the trait being assess. So we have to define the behaviors that we're looking for, and we do that by describing what the acceptable indicator of that behavior looks like. If the affective domain is included in the student's grades, and remember, not all assessments have to be included into grades, but if they are, then a systematic way to assess each student must be in place. So you have to be able to clearly state how you're assessing how you're observing students and what you're looking for and how that relates to the student's grade. And that's problematic because when we assess affective domain behaviors, it's nearly impossible to monitor all students all of the time, especially if you're teaching a large class such as 25 students or more. It's difficult not only to monitor this many students but also record behaviors for a group of this size. So when assessing large classes, one strategy is to designate a certain number of students that you will observe and assess each day. For example, if you have 50 students, then you could select 10 students each day for assessment and pay close attention to those students for that day and make a written record of that assessment. So there's lots of different tools out there for conducting affective assessments, and in the following slides I'm going to provide examples of ways to assess the affective domain. We'll look at tools such as checklists, rating scales, rubrics, journals, event recording, anecdotal records. Now you've seen some of these before, which is good because we should be scaffolding our learning and building on our content as we move through this course, but we're going to apply some affective domain examples into the following slides and the tools. So the first one you're looking at here is a checklist using Don Hellison's levels of responsibility, which is associated with the personal and social responsibility model of instruction. A checklist is simply a list of items that you want to see displayed. The teacher checks off the behaviors that are observed. The checklist for the affective domain is similar to the checklists that we discussed when we were looking at the psychomotor domain. We can use checklists formatively in self and peer assessments, or for both formative and summative assessments which you, the teacher, will administer. So on this slide here, you can see it states check each of the behaviors you use in today's class. So this is a self-assessment. Respect, participation, self-direction, and caring. So the students will be asked to complete this and to self-assess themselves. And obviously you could have them do this for others, and you as the teacher could do it for them. Okay. Rating scales. A rating scale contains a list of behaviors that you want students to demonstrate. So it kind of sounds like a checklist. However, the difference between a checklist and a rating scale is that with a rating scale, the user, which could be the student themselves or a peer or the teacher, is asked to assign a level of quality for the trait instead of merely checking for the presence of the item. So we've seen this before, but again, this is applied to the affective domain. On the table on the slide in front of you, this is an example of a rating scale. It's important to give a verbal description for each of the levels. The description, although brief, allows the user to know what the different level represents. Good descriptions of the levels help ensure consistency, meaning that everyone using the rating scale should arrive at the same score. For example, if you were watching a class, you would score them in the same way that you scored a similar class. So on this example here, this was used to assess the etiquette of your opponents. Circle 1 if the statement's not at all true. 2 if it's true some of the time. Or 3 if it's true most of the time. You should answer your question fairly and accurately, and note that this assessment was not part of the grade in this example. So the descriptors encourages others, such as saying nice shot, good hustle, and so on. Wins or loses gracefully. Both partners on the other team played equally. Correct calls were made, they didn't try to cheat, and they were courteous to others. Never true, sometimes true, true most of the time. And you can see why these behaviors are things that you would want to promote. These are outcomes that are desirable in our classes. And by assessing these, again, you're giving students the message that these are important. And perhaps if you wanted to, you don't have to, you could tie this into their grade. So you use rating scales and other examples that we're going to look at to actually come up with a grade that appropriately measures or displays the affective domain behaviors that they demonstrated in this class. So instead of just grading on participation or dressing out, we have data to back up their attitude and their participation, etc. I know this is a little bit small with the writing, but I wanted to get it all on one slide. So rubrics, we talked about rubrics before. We can use rubrics to measure affective domain behaviors, and the example on the slide is a rubric that we developed just for affective domain traits. So you can see the traits down the side. The behaviors are safety, on-task behaviors, effort, and teamwork. And it's a 4-level rubric, so we have unacceptable, passing, target, and exemplary. And when you create these, you usually want to start with what the exemplary behavior looks like for all of these 4 things. So exemplary for safety was alerts others to potential safety hazards, is constantly on the lookout for potential safety problems, and seeks to correct those with easy fixes. On-task behavior, exemplary, was characterized by when encountering a task that is too easy or hard, requests a modification from the teacher and encourages others to stay on task. For effort, exemplary was looks forward to new challenges posed by the teacher, eager to learn new skills or cognitive information. And then teamwork demonstrates leadership and the strong desire for all students to work together to accomplish a task, willing to experience personal sacrifice for the good of the team. So, and then you would fill in the other blocks there. So this is a nice rubric that would allow you to watch your students in activities and authentic situations and be able to grade them on those 4 behaviors in the affective domain. Journals. I don't have any text on this slide, but journals, as you know, you've probably done journals before, they provide your students with a way to record affective domain elements. They can be useful as formative assessments because they can let you know when the class is not meeting the needs of a student or whether students are enjoying certain aspects of the class. Asking students to respond to a prompt that will focus their comments on a relevant topic can be helpful. By requiring students to write a response to a prompt, we can gain an insight into the feelings that they may have regarding an activity. Some prompts that you might use for journal entries could include, number 1, did all members of your team have a chance to be successful? Explain your role in making that happen. If it did not happen, what could you have done to change things? Another journal prompt might be, how did you help or encourage someone else today? Or number 3, what skills do you feel confident about and which ones do you struggle doing? Number 4, how could someone help you participate at a more competent level? Number 5, if you had someone on your team who wasn't very skilled, how could you make this person feel welcome? And number 6, what was your favorite part of this unit? And then finally, what would you do if you knew that someone had cheated to win? So all of these journal prompts help the students to write responses related to the affective domain. When writing these, you want to be sure that they will require students to write a response and that they cannot be answered with a simple yes, no answer. Event recording is a simple way to tally student behavior. All we do with event recording is compose a list of behaviors that you want students to demonstrate and then record a tally mark or check mark each time the behavior is observed. So you can see on the slide here an example of a simple behavior recording sheet. To save time, you can run off multiple copies of class lists with blank columns. When it's time to assess certain behaviors, you just write them on the top of those columns. Or you can do this in Excel or on an iPad or any kind of handheld device. So you can see here that we have 6 students in the class, and pretty simply a check mark was made for whenever unsafe behavior was demonstrated, or when they helped others or they complimented others. So this allows you to record behaviors using a simple recording sheet. Anecdotal records are a way to capture the affective domain behaviors of students throughout the semester or through a grading period. Using file cards or index cards, when an event occurs in class, you could take a few minutes to jot down some notes outlining the incident. You could also create files on the computers or on a handheld tablet to record these comments. And on the slide here you can see a card with some sample comments. So you see that the teacher noted that Julie Snow in second period for the third quarter of 2012, and then a couple of comments. Julie assisted a special needs student in class today, and then the second one, Julie refused to participate. So just anecdotally noting some things. This is a form of assessment in the cognitive domain because you're just taking anecdotal records of things that occurred. So there's several examples of tools that you could use to assess in the affective domain. This slide shows the ones that we've just talked about, also includes a couple of others, and it would be up to you to decide what kind of affective domain assessments would be relevant for your classes. Remembering what I said at the start of this lecture, that kids perceive things are important if they're assessed. So if affective domain behaviors are important to us, then we do want to consider how we're going to assess those. So wrapping things up, most PE and health teachers, we do have a tendency to concentrate on the psychomotor domain, and we often neglect the cognitive and affective domains. And I think throughout this lecture we've made a case on why we do need to spend time on the affective domain, and that we should include assessments in all 3 domains of learning. In this lecture, I presented several different ways to hold students accountable for affective domain behaviors. If you first explain your expectations to students in clear and explicit terms, and then hold them accountable for demonstrating them, you will provide students with an education that will benefit them for a lifetime. It's not easy to assess the affective domain, but this lecture and the 2 readings that you're going to do provide several suggestions and examples that should help you get started with assessing these very important lifetime skills. So there are 2 articles that are on Blackboard, and these are there for reflection assignments. So I've hand selected these because I think they're very relevant and very practitioner friendly and ready to use. Read both of these and can do your reflection on Blackboard by the stated time, and I'll look forward to reading those. That concludes this lecture on assessing the affective domain.